So this is the first example of a male freestanding statue on the OCR Greek art syllabus. And he's known as the New York Kouros. New York because he's housed in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. And then Kouros means young man, and that is because of his lack of beard. He's considered a youth by ancient Greek standards. Now, this term Kouros, I just want to point out to you, it's not a term the ancient Greeks themselves would have used. It's more one that modern scholars have applied to these types of statues. The ancient Greeks would have rather referred to statues by the function that they fulfilled in society, so calling it a votive statue or a grave marker. And that's one of the biggest differences for you to remember, really, between art today and art back then, is that it wasn't aesthetic. It wasn't just there to look pretty. It actually fulfilled a function in society. And even more importantly, they also believed that statues could embody the person that they represented, especially the gods too. And we'll have a look at that in a bit more detail when we come to examples much later on, like the Cnidian Aphrodite, for example. So this statue, the New York Kouros, was found in the region of Attica around Athens, and because of it being found outside of a particular village, it's probably a grave marker. Now, the first thing that's probably jumping out at you about this statue is it looks really Egyptian with the long braided hair, for example. Also, the pose too is very inspired by Egyptian statues. And this is because it was the Egyptians that the ancient Greeks learnt to make these life-size freestanding statues from. Although the Egyptians didn't used to have theirs entirely freestanding, they had a bit of a support to the back of them. The other difference as well, if you do have a look at any Egyptian statues, is that they tend to be clothed, wearing a kind of a kilt around their waist. And it was the Greeks, therefore, that removed that and made their statues entirely nude. And as we go through different revision videos, we can have a little think about this idea of nudity. But one particular theory as to why that is representative of Greek culture is, of course, athletics. You know, this is something that is very much a part of Greek male life, and they did tend to compete nude. And there were more occasions for Greeks to be nude, the gymnasium, certain religious festivals. But we'll explore those different ideas as we move through some of the videos. Right, so I said the pose was very much inspired by the Egyptians. Now, the term that we will use to describe this is the Sentry Box Pose. And it's very rigid because if you look at the material that the statue is made out of, it's marble. And marble is not really strong enough to support moving the limbs, the arms and the legs too much considerably because they would snap off for a start. And I'm going to describe this Sentry Box Pose from the head down. So the head faces forwards. You have the arms straight down by the side and the fists are clenched. You also then have one foot forward. It's usually the left one. And you'll notice that both feet are flat on the floor, which means we've got equal weight distribution. Okay, so this is going to be a kind of a common pose that we're going to see with other Kouroi throughout this archaic period. At this time as well, they're not particularly interested in trying to be really realistic with the anatomy. So if you have a look at the torso area, we've got the impression of muscles, but they're not particularly defined or rounded. In fact, we refer to them as being etched, almost kind of just scratched into the surface of the marble. There's also been an attempt to make some kind of interesting symmetry as well within those abdominal areas. So if you have a look, you can see that shallow W shape created by the pectorals. That's reflected in the collarbones above. And the same with the V shapes. The kind of groin area, where we have the defined V, we've also got a mirrored version in the thorax above. So they're trying to make them interesting to look at, giving us some horizontal symmetry, rather than the later statues where we're going to see them trying to actually, show the body in more detail, the flesh, the bone, the muscle. And the proportions are also not quite right. If you have a look at the head, it looks slightly too large. That's because the correct head to body ratio should be 1:7, and in this case it's 1:6. And they will improve this over time, but for now that head is slightly out and the neck is slightly too long as well. You'll notice that the facial features too are exaggerated, especially the eyes, and we can refer to those as bulgy eyes. And also, we have got no emotion yet to our statue, a very passive expression on the mouth. So something you're going to see with these early Kouroi is that there's not much individuality about them. They're not meant to represent anybody in particular, but rather be a kind of symbol of a generic youth.